Welcome to everybody. So there we go. Here's our agenda for our final session of the year of 2020. We'll do welcome and introductions, which we're doing now. I'll do the webinar outcomes just in a moment. That'll be the next slide. Then we're going to do a review and put into context some of the previous information from primarily the first webinar that we did in this series, just to better position what we're going to talk about next, which is telling your personal story. And then, of course, meeting virtually in the context of a pandemic with your provincial representative or your federal representative, and then our question and answer period. So here are the webinar outcomes. So attendees will be reminded of the process for developing an effective advocacy strategy. We'll then go through the steps on how to tell your personal story, a critical part of any advocacy effort. And then finally, we'll talk about the key steps to holding a successful meeting during the current pandemic. Just before I start though, I did want to make just one quick point. The title of the webinar itself, how to hold a successful meeting with your MP or provincial representative, just a reminder to everybody that obviously, you all know MP means member of parliament. Those are your federally elected representatives. They're all called the same thing, and they serve in the House of Commons. But the reason, as many of you probably know, but maybe not everybody, that we use the term provincial representative is because there are different terms for different provinces. And so let me just take a moment and review those, because I may use these terms interchangeably, but they really mean the same thing. So in Ontario, members of provincial parliament are called MPPs, members of provincial parliament, but that's the only province that uses that term. Quebec uses the term MNA, members of the National Assembly. Newfoundland and Labrador uses the term MHA, members of the House of Assembly. And then the remaining 7 provinces and all 3 territories use the term MLA, members of the Legislative Assembly. So if you hear me say MPP, MLA, MHA, or MNA, I'm simply using them interchangeably. I'm not referring necessarily to one specific province. So if you were with us for the webinar in September, you'll recall that this is the 5-step process that you, as individuals or as part of an organization, can start doing right away to create an actual advocacy plan that you can then implement, in support of your issues. So let me go through these steps with you again, just briefly as a reminder. Step 1, identifying your issues. You need to ask yourself an initial question, particularly as an organization, if you're going to do advocacy. What are the problems, concerns, challenges that we face as a group, particularly? Try to articulate the answer to that question for as many of the issues as you can identify. However, always remember that not all issues lend themselves to advocacy. It doesn't mean those issues aren't important. It just means you can't solve them through advocacy. So in order to make that determination, we've come up with a little test that you can use even at this step 1 phase. Can the objective be achieved through advocacy, and can a target be identified? And a target is simply the person or the entity that can bring about the change that you need. Step 2, the key to the second step is to be able to narrow down complex issues so that they are manageable, or what we call consumable, from an advocacy perspective. Then you need to choose one issue that you can go forward with, because you can't have multiple campaigns with the same target. Otherwise, you'll risk getting nothing. So we talk about the fact that it needs to be one campaign or one ask, one effort per target, kind of thing. Step 3, developing your key messages. Politicians as a group, and most reporters as well, if you're doing any media work, tend to know a little about a number of different things and are required to deal with many different issues every day. This requires you to simplify as much as possible the issues that you put before them. And that's why we develop key messages as a foundational exercise in advocacy. Many issues can be very broad, complicated, and multi-layered. So when we talk about framing an issue, we're really referring to determining which aspects of the issue you want to focus on and therefore build your key messages around. So one sample that we'll often use in terms of how to organize your key messages is the first one, assume there are three. The first one answers the question, what is the problem, or what is a part of the problem that we're trying to resolve? What is the problem? What is the issue? Why are we here? Number two, what is the impact of the problem? We call this the kind of what's the big deal message. Well, tell me why this is a big deal. Tell me about the impact that this problem is having on you, your family, your supporters, whoever it may be. And then the final key message is, what could the result be if the problem were resolved? And then this final key message serves as the bridge to your ask, which we'll talk about right now. Step 4, determining your one ask. We say one because you're going to ask for the one thing you need and not a list of what you want, especially when you're advocating to government. If you ask for everything, you'll get nothing. So you need to stay focused on that one thing you need, even though you may need more than one thing. That's not the point, but it's one thing at a time, one ask at a time. So this is a case where less is definitely more. It's also very important, and I mentioned this previously when we went through this section in much more detail on our first webinar, just a reminder that your ask needs to be tangible. So you don't ask for things like help or support or commitment. Those aren't tangible words. They don't mean anything. It's very easy for a politician to offer their support or promise to help as a way to make you believe that they're giving you what you want, but that is not what you need. You need to ask for the thing, the tangible thing that you actually need in a given circumstance. And then finally, step 5, your advocacy tools. Anything that you have or produce that may be used to communicate with people is a potential tool in advocacy. We reviewed several of these tools in some detail during our October webinar, if you were with us. And of course, our topic today, meeting with your elected representatives, is another important tool in this regard. So again, I've gone through this very quickly, just as a reminder of these 5 steps that we dealt with in quite a bit more detail back in September, but it just sets up the positioning that we need to move forward with really our main topic of the day today. So let's start again at the beginning, which is, why do we meet with elected officials? What is the point? Well, in our publicly funded, privately delivered healthcare system, government is a central player, and in turn, local representatives are often the key conduit to bringing healthcare issues to the attention of governments at both the federal and provincial levels. As your elected representatives, you will need to have and foster working relationships with these individuals if you're going to advocate. You need to get to know them, and they need to get to know you and your organization and your issues. And face-to-face meetings, even virtually, are one of the most impactful forms of advocacy. I'm often asked, what is the best thing we should do? What is the best tool, for example, in reference to step 5? Well, there is no best tool, but I think it'd be hard to argue with the fact that one of the most impactful tools are meetings. And whether it's face-to-face or virtually, like we're all doing now, because again, it allows you to tell your personal stories with someone who's responsible for the issues that matter to you most. So first we have to prepare for the meeting, of course. And you want to do that by obviously having your 3 key messages we just talked about, your one ask we just talked about. You want to determine who will be attending the meeting with you. Are you doing this by yourself, or are you doing this alone? Generally speaking, I try to encourage people to not meet with elected representatives or really anybody alone, and it's for a very simple reason. Because 2 sets of eyes and 2 sets of ears are better than 1 set of eyes and 1 set of ears. And you may have a particular perspective on how the meeting went, and the person you're with on your side may have a different perspective on how that meeting went. And you're going to want to discuss that with somebody, perhaps, because you saw something, you heard something from your MP or your MLA, and you're trying to think, I wonder what that was, and maybe they have a different insight or comparable insight into what they saw. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but where possible, we usually try to have people not do this alone. You're going to write out a version of your personal story that you want to deliver, which we're going to talk about in a lot more detail right now. And then, of course, you need to request the meeting. Now, before we go on to the next step, this step around how to actually get into the meeting and all of that sort of stuff, as I said, let's talk about how to prepare and deliver your personal story with really what we call the maximum impact. So what is a personal story? Well, in a face-to-face meeting or in written communication with your elected representative, your personal story makes your issue really come to life. And it is typically either a summary in whole or in part of what has happened to you as it relates to the issue at hand. It's your perspective on the issue based on your experience, your feelings, your attitudes. It is emotional. It is supposed to be emotional. And it is really the means by which you can bring your issue to life. In other words, it makes the issue real for the politician and provides a point of connection between the two of you. And if properly developed and delivered, your personal story should fuel the logic of your one ask. And when I said it should be emotional, I also don't want to confuse people. Emotional doesn't mean sad. Emotional means all of the emotions that one feels over the course of the period in which you're talking about your personal story. And it's going to help to motivate and guide your elected representative to what you need them to do for you if properly crafted. So we start at the beginning with some basic personal details when you're crafting your personal story. The objective of this first section is to establish a basic picture of who you are and to really convey to your elected representative this construct or this idea that I'm like you, meaning I go to work, I have a family, I'm raising my kids, whatever those things may be. And so basically, here are some examples of the kinds of things that you would include in this section that we call basic personal details. Name, age, where you live, your occupation or former occupation, details about your family. I use the word details, but it's just a quick sort of summation of your family situation, whatever it may be. And always remember to use the words I and my to tell your personal story. It is all about you, and that's really important to remember. I have read personal stories that don't use the words I and my. That's not a personal story. That's a story about somebody else, my family, my children, my spouse, you know, that kind of thing. It's not using the word my in the sense of me, my. You're just referring to other people and you're describing what other people are feeling and doing. You have to use the word my as in my feelings and describe them, or I felt this way and that kind of thing. And this might seem obvious to all of you, and I really hope that it does. But there are people who struggle with this idea of talking about themselves in the context of this work, and you really do need to make an effort to do it because that's what your elected representative wants to hear. Facts about your personal story. This is the point that you transition from having set the stage with some basic personal details to the circumstances that have brought you to today. So why are you here today? What is it that you want to talk about? What is it that happened or changed in your life? And in the context of healthcare, that turning point is usually a diagnosis, for example, of a disease or having developed an issue with your health. Cancer, obviously, for example, is the typical turning point. So my life was going along and then this happened, something happened kind of thing. And again, in healthcare, it's a healthcare related matter. This is also the first opportunity that most personal stories, to start to open up about your feelings, which is critical if you're going to connect with your elected representative. Again, don't be afraid to share how you felt when you were diagnosed, for example, or how you felt as you've progressed along your health journey in the case of a patient, or in the case of a caregiver, of course, how you felt caring for somebody going along a health journey sort of thing. One of the big challenges that people have in personal stories and crafting their personal stories is getting started. How do I get started? Like, sort of thing. So here's some general tips right off the bat for you to consider. Number one, don't aim for a polished story right away. Getting started, and these are some getting started strategies, are really about letting your mind wander through possible versions of your story. That means you don't even need to start at the beginning. You can start anywhere. Secondly, don't worry about correct spelling, punctuation, or grammar at this stage. It's not important. And number three, it's good to keep in mind that you'll be sharing your story with a decision maker eventually, but when you're getting started, write for yourself. Pretend you're writing to yourself, if that helps. Learn to write what you're thinking and what you deem most important about your story. Now, in the interest of time, let me just quickly highlight the 4 ways you can get started, the ones that are listed there on this slide, without going into a lot more detail. Free writing. Free writing is writing to discover what you're thinking, what you have to say, and in this case, what you want to tell others about your issue. And it is what it sounds like. You just start to write. Just start to write. Doesn't matter, sentences, bullet points, middle of your story, end of your story, just start to write. Listing. Listing is sort of like making a shopping list. You write down laundry soap, for example, and you suddenly remember that you have to pick up the dry cleaning. Listing is where you just start to get down content in a list, and then it prompts you to remember other things. You don't have to start filling in the details when you do the listing approach. You just try to get down as many things that can trigger other things, and then capture those other things, and then you come back and fill it in. Photographs. Sometimes people remember things in different ways. We all respond differently, and so for some people, photographs are a great way to remember things. Now, just to be clear, I'm not talking about sharing photographs with your elected representative. I'm talking about as you're starting to craft your personal story, you don't know where to start, you're not quite sure where to start. Take a look at pictures and see if those pictures trigger something that makes you remember something that you can then write down that can form the basis of a personal story. And then finally, you're probably all familiar with the journalist's fundamental questions, the who, what, where, when, why, and how. That's what that 4th strategy is. Try to just pretend you're a journalist and answer those questions. So who's involved? What is the issue? When, et cetera, et cetera. And if you capture some of that content, this can be a great way to start to craft the outline of what will ultimately become your personal story. Rehearsal and reading. Here are some ideas for rehearsing and delivering your personal story that I will take a moment to go through a little more closely. And you see there's 4 of them there. The best way to prepare to tell your personal story to an elected representative is to read your story out loud, alone or to a friend or a family member or whoever it may be. As you read, though, watch for spots in your story where you tend to ad lib. That is where you improvise and add material that isn't written in your story. And try to resist the urge to improvise and to add to your written story. You need to stay focused when you're telling your personal story as you've prepared it. We really do recommend that you do that wherever possible. Next, timing yourself. When you're rehearsing the story, time yourself. Try to stick to the 3 minutes. I'm going to come back to this idea of 3 minutes in a moment. It depends on the circumstances. You can have anywhere from sort of 2 minutes under some circumstances, all the way up to, we'll even do 5-minute stories. But for today, for the purposes of this webinar and this idea that you may be having a virtual meeting with an elected representative, we're going to recommend 3 minutes. Don't rush through your story. to keep your time limit. If you find you're over time, you might have to make some revisions. And of course, if you're under 3 minutes or significantly under 3 minutes, you may need to make some additions. But again, that's just a target. No need to memorize. I alluded to this a moment ago, but your delivery doesn't need to be perfect. In fact, even seasoned advocates, we generally recommend that you read your personal story. And the reason we do that is, as I said a moment ago, because you've put so much effort into preparing it. So unless you're very good at memorizing things, or you just, for some reason, feel that you absolutely cannot read it, there is nothing wrong with reading your personal story. It's expected, it's typical, and just in the interest of not forgetting anything and using these words that you've carefully chosen and ideally carefully crafted, we recommend that you read your personal story. And again, in the context of virtual meetings, I think that's even easier than ever before. And finally, as you prepare to present your story, stay focused on telling your story or sticking to your script, as you'll want to do when you're actually face-to-face with your elected representatives, no matter what the circumstances are. And so staying focused is critical. And to help you stay focused, we've come up with something we call the 5-minute story challenge. In the interest of time, I won't go through this challenge with you in a whole lot of detail, but all of this information and more about how to create and deliver your personal story is contained in a how-to guide developed by Advocacy Solutions that will be available to you as a reference. In fact, it's on our website, but we're certainly pleased to provide it to you in the context of this webinar. But take the 5-minute story challenge just to make sure that you've really got things tightened up here, even if it's just a 3-minute version. But make sure that you really are focused on all the other things that need to occur. Now let's continue on with the meeting process, having reviewed in some detail telling your personal story. Getting the meeting. You need to decide going in, I will not give up until I get my meeting. So you need to be realistic about who you need to meet with. And if it's your MP or your provincial representative and you live in their riding, then requesting a meeting with them is very realistic. Now, there are some challenges around that. If you live in the Prime Minister's riding or the Premier's riding or something along those lines, it may be a little bit more challenging. It may, in some cases, not even be possible. But with very few exceptions, you should not have, I should say it this way, you should not have a problem meeting with your elected representatives. Call first, but most times the person that you talk to will want you to send something in writing. So have a letter or just a simple email ready to go after you talk to somebody on the telephone. That somebody could be a scheduler or a constituency assistant or somebody like that. So call them up, ask for a meeting. They'll say, usually send me something in writing, and you can have it ready to go and send it off to them. Follow up, follow up, follow up. If you want a meeting, it's your responsibility to get it. It would be nice if it was their responsibility to ensure that they met with you, but unfortunately, the way our system works, it's your responsibility to get the meeting if you want it, so you need to follow up. And if you're offered a chance to meet with somebody else, somebody who's not your actual elected representative, but say, again, a constituency assistant, that's fine. You should take the meeting. Usually you can take the meeting. It's good practice, but this is not an alternative. This should not be in lieu of having met with your actual elected representative. You take that meeting, you can have it, but then just ensure at the conclusion of that meeting, for example, with an assistant, that you say, I still want to meet with my actual elected representative, because it's important that I get in front of her to discuss this issue. Before the meeting, sending material ahead of time, it's not unreasonable to assume that if you do send any material ahead of time, especially to a politician, that they may not have read that material, but that somebody else on their staff may have done so and has prepared what we call a briefing note for them. So any material that you send to them should be brief, simple, and deliver your 3 key messages. The reason, of course, is because you are competing with every other person and every other organization that your elected representative is meeting with that day, that week, whatever it may be. So you've got to be impactful. You've got to be impactful in any written communication you may send ahead of time. Make sure that you know the participants or the attendees. Who are you meeting with? So take some time to do a bit of research. Just Google research. It doesn't have to be anything in depth, but take some time to do some research on the person that you are meeting with, or potentially people as well. There may be more than one person that your elected representative is bringing to the meeting, but certainly you're going to need to know some detail about your actual representative. The length of the meeting, we usually ask for 30-minute meetings. In the context of COVID, they've been tending to run a little bit shorter, to tell you the truth. Now, that's just anecdotally. It doesn't mean there aren't exceptions to that. But the main point I want to make here is if you ask for a 30-minute meeting and you get it, prepare for a 20-minute meeting, because it may be that somebody's late, somebody has to leave early. So don't time this down to the minute in 30 minutes. Make sure that there's some flexibility built in there so you can adapt potentially to something as little as a 20-minute meeting. If you're given a 20-minute meeting, conversely, you should probably prepare for about a 15-minute meeting. Who should attend? The number of people you bring should reflect to some extent the number of people on the other side, meaning the number of people that your elected representative has there. So if you're meeting just with your MPP, for example, you can do it alone, notwithstanding what I said at the beginning of this session, where it's always good to have 2 sets of eyes, 2 sets of ears, but you can potentially meet with them alone if there's just one of them. But if you do have others joining you, make sure everyone has a reason for being there. Everybody understands what their role is as we describe it. And one of which could be taking notes, for example, just simply taking notes. They don't even necessarily have to speak. And also make sure everyone knows why they are there. They're there to talk about the issue at hand. They're not there to talk about somebody else, something else. They're not there to hijack the meeting and to go and talk about some other issue that has nothing to do with the issue that you're there to talk about. We're back to this idea of staying focused. Like, you want to be focused in your personal story. You want to be focused in what you're talking about in the context of this meeting. And being focused means, more than anything, sticking to the topic at hand and not raising some issue that has nothing to do with anything in terms of why you're there. So in the meeting itself, this slide and the next slide provides you with a bit of an outline that you can use to actually prepare. And what we suggest is that using this outline, you create an actual document that you have sitting in front of you that you can follow along with as you're having your meeting. So right out of the gate, right at the beginning of the meeting, you want to ensure that the time that you've allotted for the meeting is still okay with your MLA or MP. Obviously, introduce yourself, explain why you're there, so the overall purpose, issue that you're there to discuss. Deliver your key messages, deliver your one ask, share some background information about the issue. We often call those core facts. They are facts. They're not subjective content. They're objective content. Your messaging is subjective, but this is factual content that you may want to share around your issue. Then you're going to want to share your personal story, obviously, as we talked about. Then after the personal story, you're going to want to sort of discuss or conclude around this idea of your one ask kind of thing, and what it is that this is the opportunity for them to basically agree to give you what it is that you've asked for, and also any further engagement opportunities or next steps that may come out of it. Consider some social media sharing as well, and we've got some content around that there for you to consider. Obviously, you're going to want to say thank you and book a follow-up meeting if applicable. It isn't always applicable to book a follow-up meeting, it depends on the circumstances. And then, of course, you're going to want to report back. to your supporters. If you're representing a group of people, you're part of a larger campaign, we always encourage people to report back in some way, shape, or form. How did the meeting go? We have report back forms and that kind of thing, but it's not very complicated. Just two more items on this slide before I go on. Assign someone to watch the time. Now, again, if you're by yourself, then you're going to have to watch the time by yourself. But if you're with somebody else, just make sure somebody has an eye to the time, because 20 minutes, 30 minutes can fly by very quickly. And also assign someone, again, it might be you, to pull the meeting back if it goes off the rails. This is your meeting, and you need to control it. So if you're meeting with an elected representative and all of a sudden they've gone way off on some tangent that has nothing to do with anything, and I'm bringing this up because it happens, and I'm not even saying it's done intentionally, but it sometimes happens. You can't let 10 or 15 minutes go by while they indulge in this discussion with themselves or you about something that is not connected to your issue. You need to politely but clearly bring it back to your issue and move on with what it is that you need to get done. After the meeting, few things: provide any information that your elected representative may have requested, get it over to them right away. Email to thank your elected representative, as well as outline next steps, and if it's appropriate, and certainly around your one ask, and confirm your next meeting, again, if that's appropriate. And also, don't forget to follow up shortly after that initial email thank you to track the progress of your agreed upon next steps in your one ask. So that initial email, which should go the same day, saying thanks, just a reminder, this is what we talked about, this is what you were going to do. But then you got to follow up. If they haven't done it, if they haven't sent you something or whatever it may be, depending on whether it's next steps or an ask or confirming a next meeting date, then you still need to follow up. So we're back to follow up to ensure those next steps are met, to ensure that one ask is ultimately delivered. And now, before we conclude, let me give you some of my further thoughts on meetings sort of during a pandemic. And I've really kind of captured them here on this slide in their entirety for your reference. So conventional wisdom, as it says, used to be that there was really no substitute for meeting in person, because of body language and facial expression, small talk, that kind of thing. And that while that's true, I think that along the way, that there was also this idea of the investment in a face-to-face meeting, which I don't know that a lot of people were really considering. And I'll speak for myself and say I really wasn't before the pandemic. In other words, it takes a lot of effort for most people and more for other people to attend these face-to-face meetings, whether you're talking about time, distance, expense, convenience, scheduling, and even physical challenges for some people. And the pandemic, if there's a silver lining to any of this in the context of advocacy, has really removed many of those biggest hurdles associated with trying to organize meetings in a physically shared or common space without necessarily losing the in-person component. And of course, with the necessity of staying physically apart, these virtual meetings now are completely acceptable, if not preferable, for the foreseeable future. I think they're going to be with us for some time, notwithstanding a vaccine and other things like that are hopefully on the horizon. I really think we're going to see virtual meetings here to stay in some way, shape, or form. People may still have preferences to meet face-to-face when we can do it again, but I don't think they're ever going away, because I think for some people, they really do represent a much more practical alternative to necessarily meeting face-to-face. And of course, let me also say that these are not mutually exclusive. It may be that on occasion, you can meet face-to-face with your elected representative, but much more frequently, you can have these virtual touch points, which I would argue will certainly enhance the whole idea of relationship building for sure, and moving your issues along in a timely manner. And finally, on this slide, it's a summary of much of what we've been talking about today, as well as some other content that we haven't touched upon, but it's there for your information. And just building on the last bullet, remember that threats seldom get you closer to your ultimate goal. You might think that sounds silly, but anybody who's worked in government, certainly like I have, may have experienced people getting very anxious with them, including threatening them, which does not work. That's why I put it in there. And it also doesn't work because, after all, there's only one government in power in any jurisdiction at any one time. There is only the current government in Ontario. There's not another government you can go to. There's an opposition you can go to, but there isn't another government that you can go to. Each jurisdiction only has one government in power at any one time. You don't have a choice to go to another government like you do if you don't like if you don't like Coke, you can drink Pepsi or whatever it may be, kind of thing. You don't have that alternative here. But ultimately, you decide how important your cancer issues will be in the context of health policy in Canada. It's not predetermined. You really do have the power to decide how important these are going to be in the context of the work that you do. So keep after your elected representatives until your ask is fulfilled, and don't stop telling your personal stories to anyone who will listen. I can assure you it will make all of the difference in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for that presentation. So we still have time left over for a bit of a question and answer period. So if you haven't yet submitted your questions, there's still time to do that. So we'll go ahead and begin with some of the questions that we have. If you're meeting with your MP and learn or suspect that they are not actually the decision maker you need, how do you leverage the meeting to connect with the true decision maker?
So that's a good question. So let's back up for a second. If they're not the decision maker around the issue that you have, then in theory, you shouldn't be meeting with them. Having said that, though, if you want to meet with them because you want to use them as a conduit or a bridge to get to the decision maker, then you simply ask them. You be transparent and you just say to them, I'm trying to find somebody in government, for example, who can help me with this problem, or I have this challenge and I'm really looking to go directly to somebody who can help me. Can you help me find out who that person is? Can you help to connect me to that person? So the answer is just ask them. Just be very transparent about it.
Thank you. Next question. If you're meeting with an official through a video conference platform, should we assume that their office will set up the meeting with Zoom links, or should we take care of that on our end?
That's a good question. I think that, so you should ask is the answer to the question. And I would expect that in most cases, constituents are offered for the platform to be set up by the elected representative. So if you just sort of play this out a bit, I'm assuming that every elected representative in Canada at all levels who are having these meetings has access to one or more platforms. I think I can say that with complete assurance. And so, but conversely, I would say that the average constituent probably doesn't necessarily have a Zoom account or that kind of thing. So I think in most cases, you can expect that they will offer to use their platform, but again, I would confirm. Now, you may want to use your own platform for some reason. You may want to share certain content, for example, that is better delivered on one platform than the other, although I think most of the platforms are doing pretty much most of the same stuff now as we've been through this pandemic. But the point is, you may also have a preference to use your own platform, in which case you can also offer that as well, and I'm sure that wouldn't be a problem.
Thanks. Next question. How do these steps apply if you're an organization and not an individual? For example, how does the personal story change?
So the personal story doesn't really change in the sense that you're going to want to have people who are impacted by the issue that your organization represents share their own personal story. Having said that, though, let's say you're the executive director of a patient organization. And let's also assume, for example, that it's a disease and you personally don't have that disease. Well, in that particular case, as the executive director who is engaged in the issue, knows patients and caregivers, but isn't personally impacted, then we talk about sharing what we call your personal experience, as opposed to your personal story. Your personal experience is kind of, here's what I've seen, here's what I know. Let me tell you about what it's like to represent people with this disease or to work with caregivers in this particular therapeutic area or whatever it may be. And so using much of the same content that I went through with you there, you craft something called your personal experience, which is a series of personal observations and experiences in the work that you've done. So that's how we change it slightly for those circumstances.
Next question, what advice would you give to someone who is anxious or nervous about having the meeting but still recognizes the importance of it?
Yeah, that's a really good question and a very understandable question. And it is nerve-wracking. It's even more nerve-wracking, I think, when you're there in person. But I would say practice. Just practice, and remember that it's not a test. First of all, nobody's judging you. Nobody expects you to be perfect. In fact, I have my own personal feeling is that when you look perfect, you don't look as authentic. And so being imperfect is, I think, a way to demonstrate that this really means something to you. In other words, I'm stepping out of my comfort zone. I wouldn't normally do this. And by the way, you can also say that. You can say, I've never done this before. I'm nervous. But as long as you've got that little meeting flow that we shared with you, as long as you've got that piece of paper in front of you, and again, because it's virtually, they don't even need to know you have a piece of paper in front of you other than you occasionally look down, but that's okay. And as long as you've got that in front of you, you know where you are, you know what you need to say, where you need to go, then you should be okay. But if you're nervous, I would just say, I'm nervous. I've never done this before, and I'm hoping that you'll be patient with me. And I think in most cases, you'll find people will be very patient and understanding. This is not something that I think any of us are born with the ability to do. It takes practice. It takes practice.
Awesome, thank you. Next question. After a meeting with your elected official, what would be the appropriate wait time for a follow-up from their office on the issues you have brought forward? How often should you follow up with them and how soon?
Sure. So there's no magic to this, but I'll answer the question. 2 weeks. So if you've met with somebody and you've sent your thank you, give them 2 weeks. And if after 2 weeks you haven't heard from them, nothing, then I would send them a reminder. And then after that, I would probably send them a gentle reminder every week after that. Gentle, not aggressive, very, sort of respectful, obviously. And just kind of keep following up in that way. I can't give you a complete sort of game plan from, week 1 all the way through to week 25 or something like that, because it really depends. But after a month, so that would be, maybe 3 follow-ups following this logic, 1 after 2 weeks, and then the 3rd week, and then the 4th week after a month. I would pick up the phone and call the constituency office, or call, probably the constituency office, or and speak with somebody and just say, I'm really concerned you're not getting my emails. Play it that way. Don't play it like you haven't responded. What's wrong with you? Just play it like, give them the benefit of the doubt. Just say, I'm really concerned you're not getting my emails. I've sent 3 follow-up emails actually in the last 2 to 3 weeks. Can you confirm that you've received my emails? Very respectful, very calm. And then I think in most cases, those are going to be exceptions to this, but in most cases, you'll get the appropriate response if you handle it that way.
Next question, how do you know if your one ask is reasonable enough? So how do you strike the balance between making sure that you're not demanding too much of the person, but you're not giving them just a vague comment asking for support?
So the ask is reasonable if it's achievable within the context of the person to whom you're advocating. So if the ask of your MLA is to write a letter to the Minister of Health saying, 3 things, that's reasonable. That's completely reasonable. They write letters all the time. They communicate concerns from constituents to ministers all the time, every day. It's their job. So that is a very reasonable, sensible ask under the circumstances we've been talking about today. You need to keep it within the realm of the possible. That's really kind of the test that we use, possible and tangible. So we don't have asks that aren't achievable. Otherwise, it's not an ask. So it's really something that that can be done, something they typically do, and not be reaching and stretching for it. And you should never be wondering, can they do this? Never be wondering, can they do it? And you shouldn't even be wondering, will they do it? You should know they'll do it, kind of thing. For example, in the normal course of their work, sort of thing. If it falls outside of that realm that I just described, that can they do it, will they do it, it's probably not an appropriate ask, and you shouldn't be asking because you're not going to get it.
Next question, if it's your first time meeting with an MP or provincial representative, and you notice that the meeting is starting to go a little bit off track, how do you manage to refocus it?
Sure. So whether it's your first meeting or it's a subsequent meeting, it's kind of all the same. So basically, one of the sort of techniques that we teach people is let somebody speak for a bit, like a minute maybe. Like let's say they're way off track, like they're talking about something that's got nothing to do with anything. So let them go for about maybe 30 seconds to a minute. You don't have to look at your watch, but just kind of gauge it. And then you're going to have to interject. You're going to have to say something along the lines of, I don't mean to be rude, but I think what you're referring to is actually an interesting point, but I know you have limited time. Say they have limited time. You have limited time, MP, and I just want to make sure that we cover this stuff. So would you mind if we just kind of got back to what it is that I know that's important for us to just kind of conclude, so that I don't take up too much more of your time. Unfortunately, it does require you to kind of insert yourself a little bit and just kind of get in there, particularly if it feels like they're just not going to stop. It may be that it's just kind of a moment in time and it'll kind of go off, they'll kind of finish off and then you can just pick it up and get back on track. But if you're concerned that they're really going way off, and by the way, this doesn't happen very often. I don't want to suggest to everybody that, this is typical. This is very atypical. But if they really start to go off on a tangent, I don't have another solution that doesn't involve you inserting yourself into the discussion to politely end it and get back on track.
Thanks, Ryan. So next question, if your MP tells you that they cannot meet your one ask and they explain why, what do you do with a hard refusal?
Well, again, you shouldn't have a hard refusal if in fact it's an ask that's reasonable, i.e. like the idea to write a letter. But if in fact that happens, and sometimes it does happen, then I think you need to really understand why. And I think you need to tell them that you're disappointed And I think you need to just quickly conclude the meeting and finish up. Now, there are a series of actions that you can take after that that, for example, could involve social media, in which you sort of share the fact that you met with your MP, you asked her to write a letter, she refused, and you're disappointed. There's nothing wrong with that. You're just conveying facts. There are other steps that you can take as well. But in terms of that moment, the moment in time, I think that's it. Tell me why. I don't understand. I'm confused as to why you can't write this letter. You do write letters, of course. I'm disappointed that you won't do it. And given that that is your choice, because it is a choice, again, this is not a crazy ask, it's a reasonable ask. I think it's best that we conclude this meeting. Might sound, it might sound kind of bold, and maybe it is, but I think that's how you need to conduct yourself if you have a reasonable ask, and for an unreasonable excuse, they're not willing to fulfill it.
Awesome, thank you, Ryan. So it looks like that's the last question we have, and we're just about at 2 o'clock. So I think it's a good time to move on to wrapping things up for today. So thank you everybody for attending today's webinar. And thank you again, Ryan, for providing another webinar about advocacy and helping people navigate how to have meetings with MPs and provincial representatives. We have a few more webinars still scheduled for the rest of 2020. So the next webinar that we have will be next week, and it's part of our Remarkable Cancer Survivors Guide series with Dr. Rob Rutledge. So that one will be next Wednesday at noon on the 25th. So we hope you'll be able to join us for that as well. Thank you again, everybody, for attending today's webinar, and have a great day.